much about politics, and they don't think in terms of ideology. When they're asked, why do you like this candidate or that candidate, they don't talk in terms of ideology. They don't talk in terms of policy. They say, I like this person because he or she stands up for people like me. Additionally, so roughly 20% of Americans, when they're asked about a candidate, they describe that candidate in terms of ideology. Additionally, ideology is very unstable, meaning that if we ask somebody their ideology in 1 year and then we ask them that again the next year, the correlation between the two time periods is very low. Perfect correlation, where it would be totally stable, would be 1. And almost no correlation would be 0. This is close to the 0.16 is what's cut off there. Oh, thank you very much. I got it. Thanks. So, in 2012, we published a paper saying, well, maybe we're looking at polarization wrong. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at polarization in terms of ideology. We know that when people talk about their party ID, they're not necessarily talking about their issue stances. They're talking about the group they belong to. People think about party ID as a social group, such as your race or your religion. It's a team you belong to. And our self-esteem relies a lot on the team that we belong to. When we're part of a team, we want that team to be better than the other team. And so what happens, and lots of research has shown this, is when we're part of a team, we start growing hostile emotionally towards the other team and feel more positive towards our own team. And there's lots of old research supporting this idea. So many of you may remember the PBS documentary about the teacher who randomly told students who had blue eyes that they're part of this team, and students who had brown eyes were part of that team. And then they started being hostile towards each other for no reason other than they were on separate teams. Another famous study in the 70s where people were separated by whether they looked like Klee or Kandinsky paintings. Then they were asked to distribute money, and then they discriminated against the other side just depending on which painting they liked. And then the minimal group experiment, people were just divided on the flip of a coin, and again you would see discrimination just based on teams. So we, and I should mention my co-authors in this paper, Shanto Iyengar and Gaurav Sood. We started looking for signs of not ideological polarization, but affective polarization. And we did this in a number of ways. We were looking at how changes in emotions towards the other side has changed over time. So first, we used an instrument that social scientists call a feeling thermometer, which is how warm or cold do you feel towards the other side on a 0 to 100 scale. We also asked them we looked at data starting in, I believe it was in the 1960s, how people, if they saw the other side as intelligent, and if they saw them as selfish. And we asked them again this question in 2000. We didn't ask the original one, but we asked them again in 2012. And then we used a measure of social distance, which is how would you feel if your son or daughter married someone from the other party? And we used data from 1960, and we looked at it again, asking in 2012. So this is the feeling thermometer difference, and the green line is how Democrats feel towards Democrats and how Republicans feel towards Republicans. It's remained fairly steady until very recently. So people feel very warm on a 0 to 100 scale, where 100 means I feel very warm, 0 means I feel very cold. The blue line means how cold do you feel towards the other side. And you see, oops, don't want to ruin the punchline, that over time people have felt more cool towards the outgroup. And the yellow line here is what we call affective polarization, the difference in how you feel towards your side versus the other. And you see the distance has about doubled between 1980 and 2012. Now, looking at the data of how people see, whether they ascribe the other side or their own side as intelligent. So this is data from the UK and the US in 1960. In 1960, people said, yeah, 30% of people said my own side was intelligent, and I don't know, roughly 20% of people in the UK, 40% in the US said the other side was also intelligent. In the UK, people feel a bit warmer towards their own side, in terms of ascribing intelligence. But in the US, what you see today is a huge gap. Roughly 60% of people say, my party is filled with intelligent people, the other side is full of dummies. In terms of ascribing selfishness, you see a similar story that in 1960 in the UK and in the US, 5% of people said my own side was intelligent, and in the UK and the US, 30 to 40% of people said the other side was selfish. Not much has changed in the UK in that time period. And again, in the US in 2008, 60% of people said that the other side was selfish. Finally, with regards to inter-party marriage, how would you feel about your son or daughter marrying someone from the other side? In the US, the black bar here says the percentage of Republicans that would be unhappy with this proposal or with this situation, and the gray is Democrats, and the bottom panel is among people in the UK. You see it's very low, it's 5% or so of people would be unhappy with the situation. And in the US, you can see here that this number has just skyrocketed. 30 to, depending on the way you ask the question, between 30 and 50% of people said they would be unhappy today if their kid married someone from the other party. In the US or in the UK, it's changed slightly, but not much. Okay, so things have obviously changed. People feel differently about the other side. Even if they don't necessarily disagree with them on the issues, they certainly hate each other more. Does this matter? It may matter in the voting booth, but does it affect behavior outside of the voting booth? Do they cause us to discriminate against the other side? Or maybe it just causes us to help our own side. Maybe it leads to in-group favoritism rather than any out-group discrimination. So we ran a number of experiments, but I'll show you two of them. The avoidance experiment, which asks, do higher levels of inter-party animosity lead people to avoid people from the other side, or does it cause people to only want to hang out with people from their own side? And then we also looked at the discrimination experiment. Do higher levels of inter-party animosity cause us to favor our own side, grant special favors to our own side, or does it cause us to want to take away rights or punish the other side? Excuse me. So in the avoidance experiment, we took 611 people who were part of an online panel. And they were told, all right, you're doing this task. It has nothing to do with politics, but you're going to need to be on a team to complete this task. The task was unscrambling words. So they were first told, here's a couple examples. Fill out the blanks here. The Milky Way is one of blank, blank, L, blank, blank, Y. So it was a galaxy. And we cued not the importance of politics for this, but the importance of education or linguistic ability. And they were told that their success would depend on the quality of their team. So they were made to believe that there were actually people waiting as part of this experiment, waiting for them to be picked, and that they were the team leader who was to pick who was going to be on which team. And so they thought they were selecting other people. And they had to select 3 people from this group of 4. So the lowest educated people, the people who would ostensibly be worst at this task, were independents. The people that were best, one person would be from their side, another person would be from the other side. So you would think that to have the best team, you would pick the most educated people, even if it didn't involve someone from your own side. But that's not what we found. That 54% of people excluded a member from the other side, even if it made their team overall less capable. And 94% of people selected someone from their own side. So this on the x-axis here is what we call effective polarization, a measure of their prejudice towards the other side. And the y-axis is the probability that they selected a member on this of their own team. And as you see, as people become more prejudiced, there's a slight increase in the likelihood that they select a member from their own party. So there's some evidence of in-group favoritism, but the ceiling, it might hit a ceiling here. People are already very biased towards their own side. But there is a strong relationship, a much stronger relationship here, between prejudice and avoiding a member of the other side. So the more prejudiced you are, the higher the likelihood is that you're going to say, no, I don't want this person on my team. So what this experiment is telling us is clearly that inter-party animosity, that affected polarization, is leading us to want to avoid the other side and potentially interacting with our own side. But the bigger effect is certainly avoiding the other side. So the next question we asked was, okay, well, does it lead to other types of behavior? Does it lead us to discriminate against the other side? So in this study, 539 people read a newspaper article about the police breaking up a student protest. When we ran this, it was at a time, I think the Berkeley protest just happened where the officer sprayed the kid in the face with pepper spray. So it was a salient issue. They were later asked whether they agreed with the police behavior, and they were said, all right, what fine would you give the student group? So we would predict that affected polarization would cause people to punish the other side more and maybe decrease the fine for their own side. Here's the experimental text. So people were randomly assigned to hear about the other side. So Democrats were told to read a newspaper article about young Republicans, while Republicans were told to read a story about college Democrats. So this is the story. Police used tear gas on peaceful young and then randomly assigned Republican or Democratic protests. And then they read this, which basically told them why this is wrong, why the police misbehaved or behaved inappropriately. So what did we find? Most people, it's good to know, disagreed with the police action. Most people did not forego democratic norms of free speech. Most people said yes, the police shouldn't have behaved this way. So it didn't really matter if it was a member of the in-party or the out-party. The fine was lower when they were asked how much should you fine the party or the student group. The fine was lower for the in-party or the out-party. And now if we look at the relationship between inter-party discrimination and the suggested fine, this y-axis is how much you would fine a member of your own party. And you see that there is a pretty strong relationship. The more prejudiced you are, the more likely you are to want to fine your own group less. But there's no real relationship between the amount of the fine and how much you hate the other side. So what this is telling us, we believe, is that inter-party animosity is leading to in-group favoritism. It's causing us to maybe, in the current environment, to say, no, don't punish our own side for misdeeds. Don't necessarily go after our politicians for crimes. But it's not necessarily telling us to go after the other side, to attack the other side, to discriminate against the other side. So in sum, what we see is a rise in affective polarization and not necessarily ideological polarization. And we see that affect affects behavior outside of elections. And it causes us to avoid the other side, but not necessarily discriminate against the other side. And that's what I got. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for everyone coming out tonight. So I'm going to kind of build on the stuff that you've talked about, and I'm going to do a little bit more talking about the role that partisan media might play in this. So often when I come, talk to community or civic groups, people are often, really interested in what social scientists think the role of, say, like Fox News or MSNBC or, websites like Drudge or Breitbart are. So we'll spend some time talking about that, and then we'll talk about a few kind of broader points at the end. So when I give these sort of talks, I always like to say that, partisan media really do two things, right? They talk about the same issues as other news outlets, but they do so from a different perspective, as well as they often talk about different stories. So I think it's useful just to see a couple of examples of that to begin with, just so we're all on the same page. So the first example is a little bit dated, but you'll see why I chose it in a minute. So you might remember back in 2012, Joe Biden, who's technically Yifani's colleague, although I've never actually seen him, though he does technically have an affiliation with the University of Pennsylvania. He announced that he supported gay marriage, and there was a lot of pressure on President Obama to, say whether or not he supported it. He went in an interview on ABC News and said that he did. Right. So here is just what you might think, right? Obama announces he supports same-sex marriage, right? And so you can click and watch a story that basically is just an interview clip with him saying that, he didn't used to support same-sex marriage, but now he's changed his mind and he does it, right? And the news story that accompanied the rest of this that you can't see, it basically just sort of relayed those basic facts, right? So that's one way, I think, relatively kind of neutral, just the facts kind of way of relating what President Obama said. Right? But we can think and say, well, how might a more partisan website or a more partisan source cover that? And, whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. Will that work? Okay, we'll try this again. So here's the way Fox Nation, which is a Fox News affiliate, put it, right? Obama flip-flops, declares war on marriage, right? So same story, but very different kind of coverage, right? A very different story that would have accompanied that, right? You're going to take away a different kind of meaning from that same story. Right, so let me give you one more sort of coverage example. So it's one that's plus achange, plus c'est the même chose. It's back in the news. Right, so you might remember this is the New York Times front page from the 10th of May last year, right, when President Trump fired James Comey. Right, and so there's the text of the letter. Right, so this is the sort of standard kind of explanation for what happened, but we might think that partisan websites would give a different one. Right, so here notice the line is James Comey resigns, right? He did not in fact resign, he was in fact fired, right? So there's two different examples of how partisan websites, right, are covering the same story as a more mainstream outlet, but are doing it from a pretty different perspective. So someone who's watching those outlets is going to take away a different message. Right? So that's the first thing that partisan news outlets do, right? So things like Fox News, MSNBC, right? The second thing that they do is they sometimes talk about different stories, right? So those are all examples of cases where, in both cases, Fox was talking about the same story first as CNN and then as the New York Times. But sometimes they also just talk about a different set of stories, right? So it's not just that they cover things differently, they choose to cover different things, right? And so there was a nice example of this a few weeks ago when it was revealed, apropos of this story, that a few weeks later, President Trump tried to fire former FBI Director Mueller running the investigation, right? So CNN, right, here's Anderson Cooper saying that Trump tried to fire Mueller, right? Here's Chris Hayes on MSNBC up here saying Trump tried to fire Mueller. And then here's Fox News, here's Barack Obama with Louis Farrakhan in 2005, right? So just sort of avoiding, in that case, right, a particular story that might be more uncomfortable for their audience, right? So this sort of suggests that we think that partisan media might have some important effects then. And so I wrote a book about this. And so, it doesn't matter. And I think the first thing, and maybe what I didn't sort of think would happen when I sort of went into the book, is that I like to argue that it reifies polarization. So what happens is that if you take people who aren't particularly ideological and you show them partisan news sites, they're like, what is this? I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. These people are nuts, right? But if you take people who kind of already get the kind of symbols, right? So if you take someone who's pretty conservative and you show them Fox, they're like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, right? And if you show a liberal, right, MSNBC on the flip side, right, then they're like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense too, right? And if I reverse those and showed a conservative MSNBC or a liberal Fox News, they're like, those people are so wrong. I know I'm even more right than I thought I was before, right? So what these outlets tend to do is they tend to take people who are already somewhat extreme and reinforce and reify their views, right? Kind of maybe drive them a little bit further apart, but they're not necessarily polarizing the mass kind of base of Americans, and we'll get back to the most important caveat to that in a minute. The second thing that they do is they sort of worsen attitudes towards the other side, right? And you kind of are getting a sense for why that might be the case in those couple of clips that I showed you, right? So Obama flip-flops, declares war on marriage, right? Here's a photo of Obama with Farrakhan, right? Here's, Trump acting crazy, right? So that they show you the kind of worst side of the other party, right? They don't necessarily, if you watch Rachel Maddow, it's not like, oh, Paul Ryan's actually a reasonable guy. He's trying to do some good things, right? It's no, here's all the bad things that Paul Ryan is doing. Here's why, Trump is wrong. And so if you watch, Hannity, it's, here's why, Nancy Pelosi and, Chuck Schumer are crazy, right? So that people who watch these outlets begin to think worse of the other side, right? Apropos of what Yif was showing in terms of thinking, the other side is less intelligent, they're more selfish, the same, kinds of attributes. The other thing it tends to do, everything old is new again, is they work towards attaching delegitimizing explanations for election outcomes. So, we can think about back in 2008, if any of you were watching Fox News then, they gave a lot of coverage to stories about voter fraud, right, and said, Hannity in particular was very obsessed with the fact that there were a couple of precincts in the city of Philadelphia where McCain and then Romney got no votes, and they said, well, this obviously has to be voter fraud, except if you look up those districts, those are districts that are overwhelmingly African American in North Philadelphia. So perhaps not a huge surprise that when you have the first African American president running, that districts that are 95, 97% African American vote overwhelmingly for the African American Democratic candidate, right? So all of this sort of suggests that partisan media is kind of bad, right? And so you might have guessed that from the title. But I want to suggest to you that we should temper this for two important reasons, right? That maybe we should be less concerned than you might think at first glance, right? And so the first important caveat is that the audience for these shows is really quite modest. So this is data from earlier. You'll see why I chose data from a few months ago in a minute. But so what I did was just broke down from the weekly Nielsen ratings some of the more popular shows, and then we'll show you at the end how those compare to partisan media outlets. So setting aside things like the Olympics, the presidential debate, the Oscars, does anyone want to guess what the the most popular regular TV program is? It's not. That's a good guess, but no. It's something that's actually only on for part of the year. Exactly. Sunday Night Football gets about a little over 23 million people watching it, making it by a pretty large margin the most popular thing on network TV. Basically, live sports are what is now holding up mainstream broadcast TV because sports, it's the one thing that people, other than things like the Olympics or like a presidential debate, the Oscars, it's the one thing people will regularly tune in for. So that's the most popular kind of regular thing. In terms of kind of sitcom programs, The Big Bang Theory has for a number of years now been the most popular show on TV. It gets somewhere between 19 and 20 million people on an average week tune in for that. The most popular reality TV show is Dancing with the Stars. It gets about 13 million people a week. The much maligned NBC Nightly News, which is the most popular one, gets about 9 million people a night, right? And we've all heard, right, how much that's fallen over the years, right? And so keep these numbers in mind. Now we're going to put up what the numbers are for Fox and MSNBC. Does anyone want to take a guess what the average primetime viewership is for Fox? So I heard 1, I heard 3. 5? Okay. The first person was actually, what? Oh, sorry, how do I keep doing this? I'm clearly technologically incompetent. Oh. Sorry, I think I keep hitting the button on the back. Okay. Yeah, so Fox News gets just under 3. It was a little over 3 million last year during the election, but it's back down to a little under 3 million. And then MSNBC is actually even smaller than that, right? So keep in mind, this isn't a nation of 300 million people. There's about 230 million adults over the age of 18, right, which would be the sort of basis number for the Nielsen tracker. So it's really only a few percentage of people are tuning into these shows. If we did something like the Cume, right, and looked at the people who watch at least some Fox over the course of a week or a month, we get a little bit higher, right? We start talking about more like 5-6% of the electorate. But it's really hard to use like credible data and get much more than like 10% of people, sort of ever really tuning in to these shows. And it's hard to like kind of estimate these broader numbers because there are, a set of people who tune into all these shows and then a smaller set of people who do that and then a larger set of people who, will kind of flip through and occasionally turn it on for a while, kind of while they're, just kind of surfing around. Right? So not that many people are really ultimately watching these shows. The second thing I'll say is that the audience is already pretty political and it's pretty old. So this is just some data. It's from a couple of years ago, but nothing in this would have changed. So you can see that it's really hard to get enough people in a survey who watch MSNBC, so we just chose Fox. But MSNBC will look more or less the same, just on the other side. So what do we see here? Right, about 37% of non-people who don't watch Fox but watch at least some TV, because that's what you need to be in this study, are Republicans. Right, about 59% of people who watch Fox are. Notice that only about 12% of people who don't watch Fox are strong Republicans. Right, so when political scientists ask you about your partisanship, we say, are you a Democrat, are you a Republican, are you an independent? And then we say, oh, are you kind of a strong Republican or a not so strong Republican, right? So these are people who really feel a strong identification with the Republican Party, right? And so, basically these are the people who are, always voting for Republicans, sort of taking, seeing the world through Republican-colored glasses. You're also much more likely to identify as a conservative if you watch Fox, right? This is that same idea of a feeling thermometer. Right, non-Fox viewers are much more positively predisposed towards President Obama than Fox News viewers are. And then finally, notice that the average age of someone watching at least some TV with political content is 48, right? But people who are watching Fox is 56. So these people are quite a bit older, right? And they're already pretty political, right? So that's another thing that's going to underline why, most people, right? I don't think this is necessarily polarizing everyone, right? And it's that most people aren't watching these shows, right? And that the people who are watching are already sort of political, right? So there's kind of both a supply effect and a demand effect, right? If you're someone who doesn't like politics, sitting down and watching, Chris Hayes or Rachel Maddow, Sean Hannity or Jeannie Pirro talk about politics for an hour is not going to be your idea of a good time, right? That most of the people who are tuning into these shows are, already kind of sold on the message. Of course, there are a couple of reasons. So that's the kind of like why maybe you shouldn't be, as concerned. So in true social scientific fashion, I now have to tell you why maybe you should, moderate it and move a little in the other direction. So there is some work that I've done suggesting that sort of social networks might help to magnify these effects, right? So there aren't that many people who watch Fox, but there actually are a fair number of people who are in a social network with someone who watches like some Fox or reads some sort of website, right? We all have that sort of friend, maybe it was like our college roommate, the guy who sat next to us in high school, our crazy cousin, who's always posting things from some sort of strange corner of the internet and sending them to you or posting them on Facebook so you see them, right? So that even if you don't yourself watch these outlets, you might be exposed to some of their content, right? And that that's a way of people who might not otherwise watch Fox and so might not really be affected by those messages might still be exposed to them. And because it's coming in this sort of different setting, right, they might be, or not they might be, we've shown that they are somewhat more open to them than if they're just, sitting down and watching those shows, which isn't something they're really normally doing. The second thing is that, I've come sort of over time to think that maybe the biggest problem with those shows is that because they promote a particular view of the world, right, things like compromise and thinking the other side has good arguments aren't really good for driving up ratings, right? What's good for doing that is exactly as you've talked about, right, kind of creating the sense of teamsmanship and like, oh, it's us versus them, and they're bad and we're good, right? And so what we should do is like stick to our principles and not compromise with the other side, right? When in fact, what we probably need is more people willing to kind of meet in the middle, right? So if you look at, the kind of, I can't remember, I think they're called themselves the Common Sense Coalition, right? The group, the one that failed in the Senate today on immigration, right? This idea of bringing together Democrats, Republicans, and Angus King, right, as an independent, together to try and form some compromise coalition, right? But the problem with the compromise is exactly what the name implies, that I give up something and you give up something, right? And we try to take the best of both sides, right? But that's not what's going to sell, right, to people who are, highly politically charged. It's going to say, no, let's go find, our position, right? It's, no legal, it's strict bans on illegal immigration, cut down legal immigration, build the wall, or, full amnesty for dreamers, full citizenship for everyone, right? No sort of sense about meeting in the middle. So that's my sort of very academic-y on the one hand, on the other hand, sort of view about partisan media. So then sometimes people, when I do these kinds of events, will say to me like, well, sorry, those supposed to come up one at a time. What, if anything, can we do about this? And unfortunately, I wish I had a great answer to tell you. I don't. I think at some level, right, elites really are sort of the key. And at some point, that will have to change. I don't know what it will be, the thing to getting that to change. But in the interim, I think one useful thing people can do, and this might sound sort of silly, but I think it's something that actually has real possibility, right, is having genuine discussions with people from the other side. And when I say genuine discussion, I don't mean, let me explain to you why everything you think is wrong, right? What it means is, I'd like to hear from you why you take the beliefs that you do, and I promise that I'll listen to you, and I might want to ask you some questions, but then I want you to do the same thing for me. Because the goal isn't necessarily to persuade people that you're right, it's to convince them that you have a legitimate point of view. And often what gets lost in sort of media coverage of a lot of these things is we sort of just hear the top level soundbite, and we just kind of hear, the kind of strident activist on both sides without really kind of explaining why people are feeling the way that they're feeling. And so we put them on with the worst kind of views, like, oh, those people don't care about America, or those people are all just racist, right? Without trying to maybe dig a little bit deeper and see what's really driving people, right? And so if you try to have a genuine kind of empathetic discussion with someone else to understand their point of view and where they're coming from, right, seeing that the other side has some legitimate arguments might make you realize that we shouldn't always be so confident that all of our beliefs are 100% correct. So that, I think is not necessarily a quick or easy thing. It's not necessarily a panacea, but I think it's one small step that we could take to help us to better understand those who have different points of view than we do. So with that, I will shut up and turn it over to Q&A.
Okay, who's going to start asking questions? Because I think there are probably quite a few of you who have some questions. Come down to the mic. Oh, you got the mic?
Okay. Hi, I have a question. What causes hostility toward outgroups? Tonight you spoke about media. But if not everyone is watching Fox News, they still seem to be expressing hostility, or would you disagree with that? Thank you.
I feel like I'm testifying in front of Congress in this setup. Yeah. I can start with the social psychological notion that it is almost biological that when we decide that we're part of a team, that we need to make our team, so our self-esteem is based on, when we join a team, our self-esteem is based on how that team is doing. So that we want to make the team, their relative standing be better. And one way we do that is by denigrating the other side or favoring our own side. That would be the social, psychological, or biological group or reason. So that may not be totally satisfying, but there are also other things that have happened in the political environment that have certainly, outside of just partisan media. So one thing that's, if you look at it's not up there, but you can see that polarization, and effective polarization, as we call it, has started to increase before Fox News came aboard. You start seeing a rise in the 1980s. There are a number of reasons people think that this started happening then. I think one that has been most discussed by Liliana Mason at University of Maryland is that Matt also wrote a book about something related to this, that Democrats became liberal and Republicans became conservative. Starting in the when was the
starting in the mid-70s.
Starting in the mid-70s, and then the Republican Party became whiter, the Democratic Party became browner, and what you have is no more overlapping identities that. Or no more what they call cross-cutting identities. So all my identities are reinforcing each other, and I no longer see any part of myself in the other group. My group is entirely just white people. Like if I'm a Republican, white people like me. If I'm a Democrat, it's different. And so these reinforcing identities exacerbate this process of identity triggered polarization. I think that's where I would start. Do you have something to add to that?
Sure. I'd go with I think there's a couple of other things that have happened too. I mean, one thing is that, when you bring to mind, if you ask most people, like, what comes to mind when you think about a Democrat, or what comes to mind when you think of a Republican, right? They don't think about, the modal partisan in America in both parties is sort of a middle-aged white person who is mildly religious, sort of Christian, but, not overly so, Just kind of like your kind of stereotypical, average Joe, average Jane, right? But if you ask most people, like, oh, who's, the average Republican, they think, oh, someone who's like a millionaire or someone who's an evangelical Christian from the South, right? If you ask most people, like, who's the modal, Democrat, they'll say, oh, they're African American or Latino, or, they're a young person, they're, someone who's a feminist or someone who's an LGBT activist, right? That people pick up on these party stereotypical groups, and they're like, those people aren't like me, and I don't like them, right? So that part of it is that, we fall prey to some of these psychological biases, but part of this is just the way, we talk about things in the media. I've also done some work just more broadly on media. When you look at what they, who they interview as sort of ordinary, people, it's typically people who hold pretty extreme views, right? And so, aside from the, proverbial kind of stories about swing voters before an election, most people in stories about politics are people who have really strong views. So people come to think, oh, most people have really strong views because, like, look at all these people, like everyone I see in these stories, right, is someone who's adopting these kind of strong views. So, I don't think the media does that necessarily with pernicious intent, right? They want to, make the story interesting and, sell papers, and the way to do that is not to say, like, most people agree on lots of the issues, right? One of my favorite things to show students is if you look at opinion on the Affordable Care Act, right, and you look at Democrats and Republicans, and you go down each provision, right, there's very strong bipartisan consensus on all those provisions. We'll get to the one exception in a second, right, which is ultimately, I think, a big part of the reason why Republicans had so much trouble with the HCA this fall. Right, because if you look, even a majority of Republicans support letting children stay on their parents' health insurance until they're 26, banning denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions. They want to ban the lifetime caps. Right, they want to force drug makers to lower their prices. They want all of these same sorts of things. The one thing where they did differ was they did differ on the individual mandate, but I think that's largely because it became such a politicized issue. So there are actually a fair number of issues where people do agree quite a lot on things. It's just that, many elite partisan actors have decided they're better off stoking resentment and anger rather than building bridges and consensus.
And one thing that Matt said here and in his talk is that it's very elite driven. That it may not be occurring on partisan media, but so as he said, Americans are fairly moderate on issues and they agree on a lot, but the elites do not necessarily, and they are increasingly becoming, and it's been happening for decades, ideologically pure. And so they attack the other side. And they do so, but the mass public, I don't think, picks up the ideological reasons for it, but they pick up the hostility.
Hi, I had a question. Most of the younger people at 30 years old or less, I don't think have this polarization. So is it possible just to age out of polarization?
So there's a really interesting article that just came out that, just looking at the audience, I'm going to say you guys are maybe a little more towards the other end of the age distribution. That it's actually your age group that's much more strongly polarized than younger people. The optimist in me wants to think that, like, yes, that will be the case. And I think it will help in one way that we'll come back to in a second. But I think part of what we also know is that young people's political identities aren't super well formed. They're still somewhat in flux until they get a little bit older. So it may be the case that as they kind of start paying more attention to politics, that sort of happens for most people as they kind of get older, right? They, have kids, they buy a house, they start caring more about property taxes and schools and those sorts of things, that they'll age into it. I think, one thing that I think will will start to happen, though, is that the millennial generation is much more racially and ethnically diverse than older generations. And so that's why I think Republicans that have long-term national ambitions, so people who aren't necessarily Donald Trump, are they're much more cautious about the positions they take on issues like immigration, because I think they understand you don't, in the long run, want to become the party of sort of white ethnic grievances if you want to be viable into the future.
I'm going to go back to that first question, why the hostility? I thought it would seem to me one of the first answers that ought to be people are afraid that that position is going to take something away from me. They're going to raise my taxes. The tree huggers are going to, damage my business. Immigrants are taking our jobs. It's that fear of losing something that feeds the hostilities. And I'm surprised that was not part of your answer. Am I wrong?
Do you have a good answer to this?
I mean, no, I certainly, if you can certainly stoke that in-group, out-group sentiment, sort of fear, there's, some interesting work that shows that anger actually turns out to be a really motivating emotion. If you kind of remind people like those gosh darn Republicans, if they get in power, they're going to, do away with gay marriage, and they're going to, roll back abortion rights, and they're going to, they're going to remove all the environmental regulations, and you should be really angry and really, charged up, right? And, you just sort of imagine the other set of arguments on the other side. So, fear and anger are certainly, part of this as well, especially, in terms of creating that in-group, out-group dynamic as well.
Let me add to it a bit. So, one part of my presentation here was that most of what we were seeing is in-group favoritism. That doesn't mean that in-group favoritism isn't necessarily driven by fear. It's driven by wanting my group to do better. But there is work saying, well, actually, there's people who disagree with that and say it's really out-group animosity, and it's driven by fear. I'd be a little bit hesitant to say that it's caused by fear of specific policies, only because I'm not sure that most Americans know what specific policies do. I mean, it doesn't mean that they can't have a stereotype of it, or they think that they know what it is. But if I had to go beyond the data, now I would say that what we're seeing with regards to what they call negative partisanship on the right, with hostility towards the Democrats, is fear of. I read this in a book last night on the When Democracies Die book that's been in the media. So their argument there is that side is being driven of fear of losing their place in society, that they are no longer going to be a white majority, and that's the fear that's driving out-group and out-group hostility.
It was quite a few years ago when Jon Stewart criticized Tucker Carlson. I forgot who the other guy was, about the way it was like a food fight between the guy on the right and the guy on the left. And that's been going on now for a long time on all the stations, whether it's CNN, Fox not so much, because Fox is pretty much ideologically pure, but even on MSNBC they have their right wing and their left wing, and it's just a fight because, basically one side always says one thing and the other side always says the other thing. But the reason they do that is because it is, I guess, more entertaining and drives ratings. So basically they're doing it for the money. Then when you go to the Congress, there was this study out of Princeton about plutocracy and about basically legislation only happens essentially when the people behind the money are behind it. And I just happened to see today, after the massacre down in Florida, they, had, I guess this was MSNBC, but they picked Rubio and Cory Gardner, a bunch of the other Republicans, and they had how much the NRA gave to each of them, and Trump got $21 million John McCain got 7 million, more than 7 million. So, I mean, honestly, it's just a bought Congress. I mean, I regard the rest of this as just, you know, for show. It's like bread and circuses. I mean, they basically vote for whoever gives them the money. And because most people really are not well informed, that's one of the things here. But, you know, in the end, they vote based on the sound bites and the ads. And, you know, almost all the ads these days are just personally destructive. So you just try and tear down the other guy, and it's all money behind it. So the question is, I mean, I don't think that, I don't necessarily agree with your point of view about the polarization. I think it's just money driving the whole thing.
So you don't agree that polarization is increasing, or that polarization matters?
Polarization is more a consequence of the fact that the money buys the positions. And, I mean, even on the Democratic side, you know, they have their interest groups, and the Republicans have their interest groups, and they respond to their interest groups where the money's coming from. I mean, because let's face it, even on immigration, it is not unreasonable to say that illegal immigration, in some sense, should be stopped. Although I certainly, you know, I'm personally in favor of everybody who's here, you know, especially the ones who've been here a long time, should be accommodated. But, you know, you can't get any compromise because it's really the same on both sides. Each has their own group that funds them and says you got to stand by this position or I'm against you, and that's the end of the story.
So, I'm sure money is important. The only, the one thing, so this has been coming up a lot, and this does not necessarily have anything to do with polarization, but it's just, there's been a lot of talk about the NRA the past day or two and how it's buying politicians. As far as I know, the amount of money the NRA is giving politicians is really nothing. And what is causing politicians to do whatever the NRA is doing, or the NRA to, you know, to be able to sway politicians the way it does, is because the NRA has a very vocal constituency, and so the people who are calling Congress people are not the moderate; they're the NRA member. And then the congressperson thinks, oh, my constituency is very extreme on gun rights, so I'm going to support gun rights. They're scared of their constituency, and the NRA is pushing a segment of their constituency to call Congress.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on what you've said, there are, you know, these sort of studies where people have gone and said, you know, well, actually, you know, 65% of your constituents or, you know, whatever, support gun control, like, you know, but you're voting against it, and they say, right, because the 20% who are opposed to it are really opposed to it. You know, and those are the people who are going to come out and vote against me if I, you know, vote the wrong way for them. Whereas the people who are, you know, who sort of support gun control, some of them it's an important issue, but other people care more about the environment, or they care about taxes, or, you know, schools, or whatever. And there's a you know, variety of different issues. So, you know, all of these, you know, the groups, you know, interest groups are actually pretty limited, right? There are strict limits on what you can give. Now, it's true, like a super PAC allows you to get around some of that, and some of that money is not technically donations. It's what are called independent expenditures, where the group kind of spends money on your behalf, but there are rules, again, about how exactly that's allowed to happen. I wish they were stricter and more strongly enforced, but, you know, I think you know, does money matter? Of course. But I think actually the bigger way that money matters is not so much on an issue like gun control, which is much more about mobilizing a constituency. The way in which money matters is the way it operates behind the scenes. It's lobbying on really small niche issues that none of us ever hear about. Like that's really what money allows you to do. It allows you, if you're, you know, Amgen and Genentech, to make sure that the rules favoring generic drugs as a cost-saving measure get, you know, excised from the Affordable Care Act. If you're into it, it allows you to block the IRS's proposal to do return-free filing, right? That's actually, I think, the true pernicious effect of money.
And one more tangential point, and we're beyond polarization, but that's okay.
Do you have any thoughts on the effect on polarization of manipulation of social media, given all the talk about governments manipulating the elections?
So, like, did the people with the Russian-linked bots and such influence the election? Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. People have tried to answer this. There's the research is a little bit conflicting on this. There's a group of people led by a famous economist from the University, used to be at the University of Chicago, now is at Stanford, Matthew Genskow, who sort of found that it's unlikely that those the bots and the people linked to Russia, swayed the election, just because there wasn't really enough. There just weren't enough of those messages out there. I'm not so sure, I guess that I think he's right. He's a smart guy. This is very carefully done. I think probably maybe the more pernicious danger is just sort of the effect of fake news isn't the story itself. I mean, I don't really think that, there was the tragic case of the guy who really thought Hillary Clinton was running the sex ring in the pizza shop, but that's not that's also someone who probably, has some other issues going on. The bigger effect is more just sort of, I think, eroding your sense of belief in something like the press, right? When sometimes people say, well, what's something else we can do? I think an important, challenge is figuring out a model to support high quality investigative journalism that gets that gets at really important, sort of stories. So I think a lot of what we've come to know about, Trump and Russia, or, Trump and, his cabinet have come from really careful and, old school investigative reporting from places like the Washington Post, New York Times, even USA Today. And it's worth noting that of all the allegations against Roy Moore, the ones that end up being the most credible and the ones that really stood up were the ones that the Washington Post reporter initially found, because they took the time to go through and really, investigate, do a lot of fact checking, and really make sure that their sources, were correct.
So, one main point in Matt's work, in Matt's book, is that political media in general doesn't have that large of an effect because the people who see it are already extreme. And it would be generally the same with, people who are seeing memes about Trump and whatnot. These people are generally already extreme, and so you wouldn't expect much of an effect. There, again, with his work, though, you would see that the people who take it seriously and then do ridiculous things are the already extreme people. Social media, is one thing that people have been talking about, and this is, again, I'm just talking about Matt's work, is that people, if you're not interested in the news and you're on social media, but you have an extreme friend, they may retweet something, and you didn't go on Facebook to look at news. You went on Facebook to look at pictures of your friends' kids or cats, but you run into this, and then this has an effect. So it's a rise in inadvertent exposure.
I was wondering about the whole nature of the media being digitized now. Maybe in order to have less polarization, you need a more discursive type of discourse. And when we have a media that's just digital bytes, then it seems to lend itself to polarization, because you're just going to get points of view that are very radical. They're very short and no length. There's no length to the development of a thought. So if you have no development of a thought, it's just going to be black and white constantly, and made more and more like that. I'm wondering what you think about that as a possibility.
Yeah, no, it's why I don't actually think, so I have a Twitter account. I don't really tweet, but I mostly do it. This is like the dorkiest thing ever, but to follow other political scientists who post about their papers, and then some political journalists I like. But it's useful for like getting a headline, but there's no depth, right, to this. You've now 280 characters, I guess, but there's still no depth or real information conveyed in that. So, I like to tell people to read a newspaper, except that's a dying art for everyone who's not already receiving Medicare. So basically the only group or more than a small fraction of people actually read a newspaper, even online, are old people. But, I think that's right. I think more information is better, but one of the things we also know is that it's really hard to get people to do that. Remember that the modal source of information for the typical person is TV news. I don't mean like the NBC nightly news. I mean like Channel 4 Action News at 11.
You showed some TV viewership numbers, and obviously MSNBC and Fox News probably contribute to polarization. But is there any relationship between the most popular shows, the Sunday Night Football, or Big Bang Theory, or I think Dancing with the Stars, the three you mentioned? Is there any relationship between that viewership and polarization?
In terms of like those people like not being politically checked in, or? Than these new shows, yeah. So I guess I'll say two things. So one is that most advertisers try really hard not to be political because it just turns people off, right? If your goal is to sell, widgets, then you don't necessarily want to identify that very strongly with a particular partisan point of view because you'll, alienate a third of the population. There is some research showing that like entertainment, media can have some effects on people's views, but they're more kind of like second order types of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's research showing that, I'm not sure how good this research is, but shows that Will and Grace, for instance, made people a little more accepting of gays in society. I don't know if how good that is, that research. One issue is that now everything is polarized. Everything is political, seemingly. Does that mean, if I had to go beyond any data, when politicians are talking about football players not standing up, and then they watch football, that primes this notion, and then they become enraged or not?
Yes, and I think it's also worth talking about, part of the reason why politics is, it's back to this point about elites being, a polarizing factor. Part of the reason why we say it's elite driven is, think about if you saw the interview with Donald Trump, and he basically said, well, I'm going to spend part of 2018 looking for issues that I can prioritize. It's some sort of vague language, and they asked the staff what that meant, and basically it turns out he's going to be looking for issues where he can kind of stoke his base, right? Things like the, national anthem, and the football players kneeling, and those sorts of issues, right? So part of the reason why things become divisive is that politicians see an incentive in making them divisive. So in the same way I always tell, students, right, when people tell you not to trust the media, they have an incentive to tell you not to trust the media, and that's because they're trying to discredit that particular point of view, so always keep that in mind.
And I'm going to take this opportunity. This time I'm going to let Matt talk about his own work, about these, maybe not football, but other mass events that can unite the nation. Maybe I'll let him talk about it.
Yeah, so I have some work showing that, you can think about the Democrats and Republicans in some ways are rivals, right? So if, Paul Ryan is the speaker, then Nancy Pelosi isn't the speaker, right? If Donald Trump is president, then Hillary Clinton isn't. But in some ways, they also share a very important common identity, and that's their identity as Americans. And so if you can get people to see the other side as Americans, more so than people from the opposing party, then it turns out they're more willing to, kind of cooperate with them, compromise, kind of see the good, in them. And so you can do some, different kinds of experiments where you, do various things to prime people's American identity. But then I also have looked at some survey data that sort of very fortuitously, the Annenberg Foundation at Penn funded a huge survey in 2008, where we're able to look at day-to-day responses, which is very difficult to do because it's very expensive to interview enough people that you can actually say something meaningful about each day. So the two things that happened in 2008 was the sample was in the field right around July 4th, right? This day when American identity becomes very salient and primed, people like the other side. It's not a huge effect. It's like on a 0 to 100 feeling thermometer, it's like 2 points, but it is there. And then you get a somewhat bigger effect. In 2008, you might remember that's when Michael Phelps broke the Olympic gold medal record. Right? And there was all this there are all these stories about this is such a proud moment for America. We have just a great Olympian to be proud in. And there was an even bigger effect right around that period in August of 2008 during the Beijing Olympics. So I've thought a lot about how you can translate that more into the day-to-day, and I don't really have any good ideas. I'm sorry.
If I might, I take your points very well. We're getting split into tribes, sort of, and we have a more favorable view towards our tribe, and we tend to reject anything criticizing the tribe. I take your point that the media is helping to accelerate this. I fully agree with the other gentleman that the Koch brothers throwing obscene amounts of money into the politics drives a lot of what happens in the country. So the real question, maybe we've got to have you come back for another night, is the political parties are what they are. What can be done to allow a discourse that is a civil discourse that did exist 50 years ago, which seems to have vanished now? What can we do to fix it?
I wish I had an answer to that. But that's, I don't give the answer that I gave in the talk to be defeatist, right? At some level, right, the solution has to come from elites. But, I think in the interim, like small scale sorts of things, are maybe like one step towards trying to do that. Like if you can't fix the problem, nationally, can you try to work to make it better on the local level?
This is more of a technical question, perhaps, but it's something I've been struggling with that is kind of making it more difficult for me to truly understand the depth of what you both are saying, because you're saying so many important things, and I really want to try to get it. And what I'm struggling with is the use of the word ideology, because I've discovered it has several meanings, and some of them are fairly neutral, and some of them are highly pejorative. And I think you use the terms as synonymous with people's views on certain issues, like on abortion or other things, as a way to show their ideology. And also said that on many issues we're closer apart than we realize. And I think you used it in a more pejorative way, which is fairly common, criticizing, say, Fox for being ideological, and say the Times was implicitly not. Although, even though I love the Times and read it every day, I think it is ideological in a certain way. I can predict pretty much what most of the journalists are going to say. So could you maybe help me clarify what you guys mean by it? And even the question earlier about football, there is a school of thought that said that football is highly ideological. I mean, people have written about that. Basically, I forget the person's name who died recently, the idea that we're amusing ourselves to death through such means as football, and it's keeping us from being more engaged and seeing the effects that you talked about, that we're less alert on certain issues. So how do you see ideology? Maybe that'll help me understand some of what you're saying better.
There is, the way that political scientists generally talk about it is ideology is a worldview that tells you, I know what goes with what. I know that being conservative means I am pro-life and I want a smaller government, and ideology is an interconnected worldview. That's one definition of ideology. And this is why when I say there's not ideological polarization, people don't really think about that. People don't really know what goes with what. Now there is, and this isn't, the more Marxist notion of ideology is kind of what is the underlying power structure in society. That's a different definition as far as I know. And I think if you're thinking about it in terms of that, who controls power? Sure, football, certainly you can say reifies ideology. So the American ideology is this patriarchal capitalist system. That's certainly one notion of ideology. And then when you watch football, that with advertising and violence, that certainly stokes ideology that way. I don't know if you had a different definition.
No, I mean, the other thing I'll say is that, like all academics, we can never be content to just give a word one meaning. So the most treasured right of all academics is first to hear their own voice, and second to change their mind even during the same talk.
Tell me, you think that the rise in effective polarization is an outcome of the political parties moving to a primary system for selecting candidates, or do you think that's a coincidence?
I mean, it's this interesting thing that the direct primaries come about very early in the 20th century, right? Ironically, as a solution to a different set of problems, right, that they're put in place by progressive era reformers, basically saying, oh, these parties are so corrupt, it's just machines that choose these candidates, the people should have a voice. And so, I think the sort of argument for why it's not necessarily that primaries prima facie cause polarization is that we have had primaries for a long time before anyone talked about polarization. In fact, if you go back and read political science from the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of it was about how we needed actually a more polarized system in America, that Democrats and Republicans, if you remember, both parties actively tried to get, recruit Eisenhower. There's the famous line, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them, from George Wallace, right? And then so in a case of be careful what you wish for, now maybe they have that, ideological clarity that people at mid-century had longed for. So primaries in and of themselves, I don't think cause polarization, right? There's maybe some stronger evidence, although even here it's not as strong as one would think, that given relatively low turnout, that in primary elections tends to increase it, but it's one of those strange sort of puzzles that I've never heard anyone explain particularly well, because I think it's just an unresolved puzzle, that something that seems to be so logically correct, there just is not a lot of evidence for when you actually go to the data.
If I had to, speculating why primaries potentially could lead to polarization, effective polarization, is there is low turnout in primaries, but the people who vote in primaries tend to be political extremists, and then they would elect more extreme candidates who then are more polarized or more polarizing. That seem fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, at one point I was like, oh, I'm going to, show this, and I, went and gathered all this data, and it's just not that strong. The relationship is not as strong as you would think it would be, and I've talked to a bunch of other people who have come up with a bunch of different ways of doing this, and there's some other missing ingredient there. I think that's right. It's maybe just less I think there must be some other wrinkle to it that we haven't figured out.
But I guess the evidence of, or the absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence in this case.
I have a question. I also have some thoughts about this. The whole idea of it being a zero-sum game. I mean, politics is like sports because there's a winner and a loser. But I think that we need to, as individuals, prove to ourselves that the guy in front of you at the grocery store is just another person, just like you are, and is shopping for food because their family wants to eat and has kids that are growing up. And, if we, one by one, take that upon ourselves, we can prove to one other person every day that just because I'm for something doesn't mean I'm against you. What do you think about that?
No, actually, the president of PEN, Amy Gutman. The president of PEN, Amy Gutman, has written about this. She calls it the spirit of compromise, right? The idea that we need to kind of come to politics with an understanding that we should try to see the kind of wisdom in the other side, like kind of meet people in the middle, view it as a collaborative rather than a combative exercise. And so that's why, I think that sort of tribal point of view is useful for politicians who want to mobilize people, right, to win elections or to raise money, but it's much less useful as a philosophy for governing.
There's one interesting study shows that, and this is related to how we see the other side, is that people don't see the other side as people. They see them as stereotypes. So you ask a Republican what the average Democrat is, and they think, 80% of them are gay and black. You ask a Democrat, and they'll say, 90% of them are neo-Nazis. So people hold these stereotypes in their heads that aren't true, and then if you correct these stereotypes and tell them, well, actually, this is what the average Republican or the average Democrat looks like, polarization decreases.
Several times you've mentioned that elites help drive the direction things go in. So just so I can understand, can you give me an example of someone you would, or a person or a group you would classify as elites?
Sorry, we should have been clear on this from the start. When political scientists talk about elites, we typically mean elected officials. So think of Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Bernie Sanders, if you like him, Donald Trump. Those are all elites. You could be a little bit more expansive and think about people that run, major interest groups or, other people. So, I think about elites kind of informally as people who make their living doing politics, right? Not necessarily people who are activists, right? People who just like politics and do it on the side, but, people whose day-to-day job is sort of, making or trying to influence political decisions.
Are there any more questions? Under that definition, the Koch brothers wouldn't be elites.
Yeah, I guess under that definition, they're not. I guess I wouldn't get too hung up on definitions in that case. I think they're still, arguably important players, and ones who I think are playing a sort of long, and they've been pretty clear on this. They're playing a long game, that they're looking to more kind of shape things in the long term rather than in the near term.
I think.
Yes.
It is a bit, it depends on who is talking about elites. But so when we talk about elites in the first go-round, we all say Congress people. But depending on the author, an author can say, they're an elite because they sign petitions occasionally. So it does depend on who's writing the article about political elites.
So I think that we've done with the questions, and they were all really quite good. And I want to thank you very much, but I want to end with a question. Are you optimistic about the future?
I mean, I guess my hope is that America has proven to be nothing if not resilient in terms of reinventing itself, reshaping its politics. So I want to think that in the end, most people want the same sort of basic things out of government, and they'll hopefully be able to work together and do that. That said, on the day-to-day when I guess now virtually read the newspaper or, turn on the TV, I have to say I'm not always optimistic in that particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, currently I'm reading a book called How Democracies Die, so I'm not sure. Today I'm not sure how optimistic I am. But, norms have certainly been eroding in America, and there are certainly problems. But it has not gone as fast, and institutions have held up much stronger than I thought they would a year or two ago, or whenever January 20th was.
Mm-hmm. It just feels like 5 years.
Yeah. Well, did you guys learn something tonight? Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.